I almost took the money and walked away from that boarded-up cottage in the woods, just like everyone else told me to. But if I had, I never would have uncovered the truth my mother died protecting. A truth buried beneath rotting floorboards and sealed behind decades of silence. A truth that made powerful people very, very nervous. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning while I was halfway through a double shift at a mechanic shop outside Boise. The kind of place where the smell of oil seeps into your skin and never really leaves. And when the receptionist handed me the phone and said it was a lawyer, my first thought was that something had gone wrong with my mom's estate again, even though there wasn't supposed to be much left to deal with. She'd passed 6 months earlier, and by then I'd already gone through the motions, signed the papers, emptied her small apartment, packed away the few things that mattered, and tried not to think too hard about all the things she never explained, like why she never talked about her past, or why certain questions made her shut down completely. So when the man on the other end introduced himself as Daniel Mercer from a firm I'd never heard of and told me there was an additional asset in my mother's name that had just cleared probate, I almost laughed, because my mom hadn't had anything extra, not money, not property, not secrets, at least none she ever shared. But then he said the word cottage, and something in his tone made me stop wiping my hands on the rag and actually listen. He explained it was located in a small town in western Montana, somewhere outside a place called Blackrich, and that it had been in her name for over 20 years, sitting unused, taxes paid through a trust that had just run dry. It's in poor condition, he added carefully, like he was choosing his words to avoid saying something worse. And frankly, Mr. Carter, most people would consider it a liability rather than an asset. That should have been my cue to sign whatever paperwork he sent and be done with it, to let the county take it or sell it off for whatever it was worth. But instead I heard myself asking for the address. I don't know why I did it. Maybe because my mother had always been so careful, so deliberate about everything in her life, and the idea that she'd quietly held on to a piece of property for 2 decades without ever mentioning it felt wrong, like a sentence missing its final word. The drive took me nearly 2 days, long stretches of highway cutting through empty land and pine forest that seemed to go on forever, and the closer I got to Blackrich, the more I felt that strange pressure building in my chest, like I was heading towards something I couldn't quite name. The town itself was barely more than a cluster of buildings along a single road, the kind of place where people notice a stranger's car before it even reaches the gas station. And when I stopped to ask for directions, the woman behind the counter froze for just a second when I mentioned the address, her smile tightening in a way that told me she knew exactly what I was talking about and didn't like it. "That old place?" she said, glancing toward the window like she expected someone to be listening. "No one's been out there in years." I asked if it was dangerous, and she hesitated long enough to make the silence feel heavy before shrugging it off and scribbling directions on a receipt. "Just be careful," she said, and I could tell she wanted to say more but wasn't going to. That was the second moment I should have turned around, but by then curiosity had already sunk its hooks into me, and I followed the narrow dirt road she'd marked until the trees thickened and the signal on my phone disappeared completely, until finally the road opened into a small clearing and I saw it for the first time. The cottage didn't look like something someone had simply abandoned. It looked like something that had been deliberately shut away, every window covered with rough wooden boards nailed in place, the front porch sagging under years of neglect, the paint peeled down to gray, weather-beaten wood, and the whole structure leaning slightly to one side like it was tired of standing. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, like the air around it was too still, too quiet, as if even the forest didn't want to get too close. I stepped out of the truck and the crunch of gravel under my boots sounded louder than it should have, echoing in that unnatural silence. And that's when I saw the words on the front door, painted in thick, uneven strokes that had faded but were still impossible to miss. "Leave it buried." My first instinct was to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just some kids messing around or an old warning that didn't mean anything anymore. But the closer I got, the more I realized how deliberate it looked, how the paint had been pressed into the wood like whoever wrote it wanted to make absolutely sure it wouldn't be ignored. I stood there for a long time just staring at it, feeling that same tightness in my chest grow heavier, because suddenly this wasn't just about a forgotten property anymore. It was about my mother, about the life she never talked about the possibility that there was a whole part of her I'd never known. I remembered the way she used to deflect questions, The way certain topics would shut her down instantly. And for the first time it occurred to me that maybe she hadn't been avoiding the past because it hurt. Maybe she'd been avoiding it because it was dangerous. The thought should have scared me enough to leave, to get back in the truck and drive until the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. But instead I found myself stepping onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight, reaching out to touch the boards nailed across the door. They were old, but not as old as the house itself, which meant someone had sealed this place up on purpose, long after it had been built, long after it had been lived in. My hands hesitated for just a second before I grabbed the edge of one board and pulled, the nails groaning as they resisted. Then finally, giving way with a sharp crack that echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. And in that moment, as the first board fell to the ground, and a thin line of darkness appeared between the door and the frame, I realized I had already made my choice. Whatever my mother had left behind here, whatever she had tried to keep hidden, I wasn't walking away from it. Not anymore. The moment I stepped inside that boarded-up cottage, I understood something immediately. The warning on the door hadn't been meant to scare people away. It had been meant to keep something hidden, something my mother never wanted found. The air inside was thick and stale, the kind that clings to your lungs. But what hit me harder was how intact everything was. I had expected decay, collapse, maybe even emptiness, but instead, it looked like someone had simply walked out and never come back. A blanket still draped over the couch, a mug left on the table, books lined neatly on a shelf. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. I moved slowly, every step echoing too loudly in the silence. And that's when I noticed the photographs on the wall. At first, I barely registered them, but then I stepped closer, and my stomach dropped. They weren't strangers. They were me. Me as a kid. Me at birthdays I barely remembered. Me with my mom in moments I knew had happened, but I had no memory of anyone ever taking those pictures. My chest tightened as I stared at them, because there was no reason for these to be here. My mother had never mentioned this place, never hinted at anything like this, and yet somehow this cottage had been watching my life from a distance. That's when the unease started to settle in, heavy and cold, and I began searching the rest of the house with a growing sense that I wasn't just looking for answers. I was stepping into something I didn't fully understand. Everything I found only made it stranger. The kitchen was stocked with long-expired food. The bedroom looked lived in but untouched for years, and there was a notebook on the nightstand filled with nothing but blank pages, like someone had planned to write something important and never got the chance. It all felt staged, intentional, like the house itself was holding its breath. And then I found the rug. It sat in the center of the living room, slightly out of place, and the moment I stepped on it, I felt the difference. The hollow sound beneath my foot that didn't match the rest of the floor. My pulse quickened as I knelt down and pulled it back, revealing a wooden hatch built seamlessly into the boards, the edges worn just enough to show it had been opened before. For a second, I just stared at it, every instinct telling me to stop, to leave, because whatever was down there was the reason this place had been sealed up in the first place. But I didn't come all this way to turn back. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The hatch opened with a low groan, revealing a narrow staircase descending into complete darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, switched it on, and started down slowly, each step creaking under my weight, the air growing colder with every inch. And then I reached the bottom, and everything changed. Because what weighted down there didn't belong under a rundown cottage. The room was solid concrete, clean in a way the house above wasn't, lined with shelves, equipment, and metal cabinets that looked like they had a purpose. This wasn't storage. It was a facility. There were stacks of documents, labeled boxes, old tapes, and sealed envelopes arranged neatly across a long table, like someone had spent years preparing them. My heart was pounding now as I stepped closer, drawn to the table without thinking, because I already knew. This was what my mother had left me. This was the real inheritance. I picked up one of the envelopes, and the moment I saw the handwriting, I knew it was hers. There were dozens of them, each marked with dates or codes I didn't understand, but one stood out immediately. It had my name on it. Just my name. Nothing else. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened it, unfolding the letter inside, and the first line hit me harder than I expected. Asterisk, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't protect you from this anymore. Asterisk, my throat went dry as I kept reading, each word pulling me deeper into something I wasn't ready for. She wrote about secrets, about something that had gone wrong. Years ago, about evidence hidden beneath this house, evidence powerful enough to destroy people who would do anything to keep it buried. And then I read the line that made my blood run cold. Asterisk, if they find this, they won't just take it. They'll make sure it disappears. Asterisk, I lowered the letter slowly, the weight of it sinking in, because suddenly everything made sense. The boarded windows, the warning on the door, the silence surrounding this place. This cottage wasn't abandoned. It was hidden. And just as that realization settled in, I heard it. The crunch of gravel outside, the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up to the house. The moment I heard that car pull up outside the cottage, I knew whatever my mother had been hiding wasn't buried deep enough, and now it had found me. I didn't have time to think, only to react, stuffing the letter back into the envelope and scanning the room for anything I could grab quickly. Because the instinct wasn't just fear, it was urgency, the kind that tells you you're already too late. Footsteps echoed faintly above me, slow and deliberate, like whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. That was worse. People who rush make mistakes. People who don't already know what they're doing. I killed the flashlight and stood in the dark, barely breathing, listening as the front door creaked open upstairs, the sound carrying down through the floorboards like a warning. They were inside. For a split second, I thought about running, bolting up the stairs, making a break for the woods, but I knew I wouldn't make it far, not if they were prepared, not if they had been watching this place long enough to know exactly where I'd go. So instead, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I went deeper. There was a second door at the back of the underground room I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a metal shelf, and I forced it open, slipping through just as I heard movement above shift toward the center of the house, toward the rug, toward the truth I had just uncovered. The passage beyond was narrow and rough, more like a maintenance tunnel than anything official, but it led away from the cottage, away from whoever had come looking, and I followed it blindly until I saw a faint glow ahead, daylight. I climbed down into the woods behind the property, my heart still hammering, my hands shaking, and I didn't stop moving until the cottage was out of sight. I didn't go back that night, or the next. Instead, I drove straight into town and made a decision my mother never could. I didn't hide it. I didn't bury it again. I contacted someone, a journalist, the kind who digs into stories people don't want told, and I handed over everything I had managed to take. Copies of documents, photos of the room, the letter she wrote to me. It wasn't the full archive, but it was enough. Enough to prove something was there. Enough to make it dangerous for anyone to pretend it wasn't. The story didn't explode overnight. There were denials, threats, attempts to discredit it. But truth has a way of spreading, especially when someone tries too hard to silence it. Investigations started quietly. Names surfaced. Patterns emerged. And just like that, the people who had shown up at that cottage stopped showing up anywhere at all. Months later, I went back. The boards were gone from the windows, the door hanging open, the place no longer hidden, but the room beneath had been cleared out completely, wiped clean like it had never existed. They had taken what they could, erased what they thought mattered. But they were too late, because the truth wasn't buried in that cottage anymore. It was out, and as I stood there in the quiet, looking at what was left behind, I finally understood what my mother had given me. It wasn't just a secret. It wasn't just a warning. It was a choice. She had spent her life protecting it. I had chosen to reveal it. And in the end, that's what changed everything.